Our speaker is really highly regarded in this industry for his drive for organizational development. He's none other than Dr. Bob Aubrey. He is CEO and founder of ASEAN Human Development Organization. A little bit about him. He is a global expert in human development and leadership, has enriched workplaces in 25 or more, right? 25 and more countries across 6 continents. He has 14 published books. His influence spans personal development, learning, leadership, organizational development, and corporate strategy. He founded the ASEAN Human Development Organization to advance workplace well-being across the ASEAN region. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Bob Aubrey.
Let me see if I got the mic right. Can you hear me okay? Good. Let me begin by asking how many of you, most of those of you who are working in companies, have employees who are outside Singapore? Just raise your hand. So it's about a third. Okay, good. Because I'm going to be giving a larger context at the beginning. I'm going to talk a bit about ASEAN. I'm going to talk about also how the function of human development is changing what human resource professionals actually do. And then I'm going to come and land on a specific study that we're doing in partnership with Intellect and what policies are being created across the region in the area of mental health. All right? Now I'm going to go fast. I have 20 minutes and about 20 slides. So I'm going to skip over some of the details, but you will be able to get copies of any of the slides that I'm skipping through as we go ahead. Shall we begin? All right, so let's look at ASEAN again. It's the 10 countries. And the ASEAN Human Development Organization is pretty new. We started in 2019, as you can see from the top picture, and we're slowly getting established in other countries. In fact, quite similar to what Intellect is doing, I would say. And I just came back from one of them that is Timor-Leste, which is way down on the bottom, which is the next country, hopefully, that will be joining ASEAN. So that's the ASEAN Human Development Organization. And one of the things that you would be conscious of is that the countries are very different. And it's not just economically, it's culturally, etc. And so mental health and well-being is also very different. It's not just economic, it's also cultural, it's also the type of government that you have. But when you're in companies, you want to be able to have your employees being fairly treated or in some ways equally treated across the countries. And this is a problem in this region. So what we decided to do was to shift from the focus on straightforward HR as a sort of administrative function to the human development needs of the region and going cross-border. That's the idea. Let's go to the next slide. So what is human development? Well, if you go back to the 1990s, the United Nations really redefined human development. And I want to build this slide because it's very important if you're thinking about what are companies doing and how are companies evolving in the treatment of people today. So here, expanding the process of real freedoms that people enjoy. So that's one of the areas is freedom in the workplace is something that's quite important. The next slide is the expansion of freedom, and this is really important, the primary end. And what this means is that for a human development professional, as opposed to a human resource professional, people are an end and not just a means to profit. I'm going to have another slide to show what the difference is, but this is where it comes from, is this idea. Now, on the left, Amartya Sen, and on the right, he was from India. This is an Asian actual concept. Mahbub ul Haq was from Pakistan, were the ones that created the Human Development Index. You probably heard about that. And you've probably heard, and Amartya Sen won the Nobel Prize on this definition of human development. And this comes into into the International Labor Organization, which has translated that human development need into the concept of decent work, which is a very relevant concept across ASEAN. Let's go to the next slide. That's where it comes from. And what does it mean in terms of functions is the function is changing. So we use in Singapore HR and HC. In fact, I've never heard a Singaporean use human development, and I think there's a reason for that, and I'm going to give you my reason first. But what's the difference? Here, the idea that HR is that people are a means to profit, right? So basically, you have to manage them. Efficiency, productivity is very important, and it's basically an administrative and execution function. In terms of human capital, you add on an economic value definition, which is that people are human capital, they have a value. The measurement of human capital, by the way, is how much money do you make, how much income do you have in a lifetime of career. And unfortunately, Singapore, the policies have been very much HR and HC oriented in the sense that it's about really work. The workplace is a place where people should be making money. And you all know from your personal experience that having a job and that kind of ideal is now creating a new shift in the society in which people are saying, well, is that all it's about? And that creates some of the mental health issues that we've been seeing in the Singapore society as well. But on the right side, let's go back to that side. On the right side, people are a purpose as well as a means. You have two priorities which can be conflicting, but they're not opposed, right? Just in the way that making profit and cutting costs or expanding your market may be conflicting and you have to make choices, but you're actually looking at both as a priority, okay? So it's not a simple solution. This is for HD leaders who are looking across what they have to do in terms of the workforce that they want to create. And it's a development strategy. It's based on the United Nations principles, as well as the ASEAN principles, such as the ASEAN 1967 Charter, and also particularly the 2012 Declaration of Human Rights, the 40 human rights. There are 3 of the human rights of ASEAN that are development human rights. Let's go to the next one. So that's where we're coming from, is this sort of shift that you see. Don't worry about the details, but there are drivers that are pushing from the traditional human resource concept and function to a much more humanistic, if you will, concept. And mental health is very much one of the indicators. Diversity, equity, inclusion is another one. ESG, environment, society, and governance is another one. So there are a lot of drivers that are pushing those people who are responsible for people in organizations into a much more strategic role and into a role that says that we must be able to make decisions. And that's where I think we see the context of the interest of of mental health and well-being, which is the WHO definition of mental health is not just mental health as absence of disease or absence of symptoms, but also well-being as a positive concept of work in the workplace, which means, and that's what we're here for in the terms of human development, is that work can ideally become a development experience. So it's not just trying to get rid of mental health issues, but also also that we're actually positively benefiting people as they work, and that work itself is a development experience. Let's go to the next slide. So in terms of improving mental health in the workplace, AHDO has partnered with Intellect to start to see what is actually going on in the ASEAN workplace, because it's very different from one country to the next, and we didn't have this data. So we're writing a white paper. We initiated a white paper, and I'm going to tell you where that started. But we had some of our members going through the Human Development Certification Program. They do these action learning projects. What do you want to work on? They're completely free. One said, we want to work on mental health in ASEAN. Oh, okay, that's a good project. So I'm going to tell you about what they did for the project. But within May, June, we're going to have more data, and you'll be seeing that in some of the future conferences. So it started this way. And the other thing that became very important was when we went to the ASEAN Human Development Directorate in the ASEAN Secretariat, they say, could you do the public sector as well as the private sector? So we contacted the public sector, and so now this study is being applied to the private and the public sector, which is really what it should be to make sense, because governments as well as companies have to deal together with this issue, just as we have seen in cases like the COVID crisis. Let's go to the next slide. So just to give you a background, this started with this action learning project. There were people from Singapore, Cedric Chu, who at that time was at the SHRI, someone from Philippines, someone from Myanmar, someone from Thailand, who got together, and that's what made it a very interesting project, is that they were looking at it from very, very different country perspectives. Let's go to the next slide. So what did they see? First of all, and I think the fact that this room is full is a very good indicator. They say the time is now, and that's what they were seeing in all these countries, is that it's a significant contributor. Coming out of the COVID crisis, we're much more sensitive to social signs, and this is coming, and it's really the social factors that push the way we treat people in companies. Women in the Me Too movement, diversity from the American Black experience, and so these social factors push the way companies manage people. And we're seeing that in the mental health sector as a time in which there is this sort of shift, a paradigm shift, if you will. And we're starting to see also some of the symptoms difficult to assess, because is it because we're reporting more symptoms, or is it because people are having more symptoms that we're actually getting this data, right? But there's a gap between the treatment, there's a gap between countries, and then there's a gap between the need and the treatment. And this is exactly what you're trying to address. And that's why we wanted to partner with Intellect, because they're doing something about it in a sustainable way as a company, to be able to provide help and support in a way in which companies can afford and agree to pay for. Let's go to the next slide. So what's the current situation? There's no policy. That's a bad thing, because if you're managing across countries and there is no policy for the region, and some countries have no policy at all, and I can remember going to a country, talking to one of the main large employers, saying, do you have mental health, right? We have people with disabilities, but in many countries, it's only physical. So mental health issues are not considered in the legislation or in the policies. And the person, the HR team said, yeah, but we don't hire them because they can't work. We don't hire, autistic people they can't work, right? And so why should we even bother, right? That's for somebody else. So it's part of the policy. It's something that we're trying to that's why we're doing this white paper. Let's go to the next slide. So just to give you a taste of what it's different, there's a stigma on mental health, and this is true of Singapore, as you all know. It's evolving, but let's look at Singapore in the middle. Strong stigmatization of people proceed with mental health conditions for people to seek professional help. Philippines, the stigma is also there. They tend to hide the problems. They keep it inside. And the health cards don't cover that area. And on the right, in Thailand, mental health problems not openly talked about. That's cultural. Mental health and wellness is promoted through, this is cultural, mindfulness. It's a Buddhist country. So they go through their own culture to be able to deal with mental health as a more of a religious issue. Next slide, please. But this is an interesting one. So what they did, this is a small sample, right? It's 122 people. But what they did was they were saying, do you talk with your manager about mental issues, about well-being or mental health issues? And these comments, we perceive it as a personal issue. I don't want to be judged. There's a shame of being weak if you're talking about having a mental health issue, being stressed or unable to sleep or those kinds of issues. Not sure how to talk about it. And if you're a manager yourself, who are you going to talk to? Maybe people don't talk to you, but who are you going to talk to? Where do you get the help from? So it's really one of the management issues of today is how do we deal with them? Let's go to the next slide. So what do we do about it? And I'm addressing the HR professionals, particularly in the room today, is to say that there are quite a number of things. So there are solutions, but there is a sort of transition in which your job, your responsibility, and the risk that you have of getting it wrong is increasing, which means that you have to be able to be more capable and more ready to deal with these kinds of issues. And it means also probably taking leadership, because if your managers have never been trained in this, and they haven't, you don't get this in business school. Many managers have gone through either engineering education or finance education. They don't get this, right? They didn't do psychology courses. So you're left with a very important responsibility of taking leadership to do something about it. And what can you do? Well, obviously, you have to look at the legislation. And I think you have an important role of saying to the governments, not only in Singapore, but the governments that you're working with in the other countries, we are going to have a policy in our company, or we are going to start selecting people with mental health issues, and we are going to also be able to support people and again, that's the sort of negative side. But on the positive side, my job is also to make people be able to thrive and to develop through work, and that is a very noble cause, right? And it's a very big challenge, as you know. But that's where we are going, is into this very fundamental paradigm shift, right? So evaluate the effectiveness. That's why the white paper is important. That's why the data that you get, and we just had the insurance company saying we need to get the data for us to be able to do our job. But there's an education, there's a legislation issue, there's a coaching issue, there's a policy issue in which you have to go to your boards and say, we need to do something about this, and I'm going to be exploring how we can actually make a difference, okay? I would like to say, and we're nearly at the end, that there is this push that is growing on companies from a source, right? So if you think of what actually drives change in the way we manage people, well, one is the people themselves. You know, we say in HR retention, but in countries where you have unions, they will say, okay, we disagree, we're not being paid enough, etc. So that's employees push, right? But we also had, what we're having now is that the investors are pushing. And the investors are saying, I am not going to invest in your company, or if I invest in your company, we talk about the environment, global warming, etc. But mental health is one of those issues, and say, I'm not going to invest in your company unless you can show me that you're doing something positive about the workplace. So there's a negative risk factor, but don't be obnubulated by risk. It's not just a question of compliance and reporting. It's also a question of being able to do something positive. And so that's where I would like to leave it today. Let's go to the last slide. I think that's the last. Is that the last one? To say there is this paradigm shift, and there probably are going to be more and more policies as we go along. Singapore is in a position of leadership because we have quite a sophisticated management of people. I think one of the responsibilities of Singapore in the region is also to carry that leadership forward. It doesn't mean that the other countries don't care. It means that they just don't have the management systems ready, up and running yet to be able to deal with this. Although you will find probably some very surprising initiatives that are taken here and there in those countries for people at work and for mental health and mental well-being. Thank you very much for listening to me this morning on this area.
Thank you, Dr. Barbary. Now, I just want to leave the QR code here to see if there are any questions for Bob. That was a very insightful sharing. Oh, I think, okay, it will take a while sometimes, but do pop your questions in. Yes, of course. You want to use the mic? No, I think you're thinking.
Thanks. Hi, Bob. That was
Hi.
wonderful sharing. And I'm so thrilled that you started the ASEAN Human Development Organization.
Thank you.
So a couple of questions. One is, how is that aligned to the ASEAN Human Rights Commission and the whole entity there? But two, talking about the policies, right? I also want to just put out an offer. So I'm part of the ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights.
Oh, right.
And we've recently just decided to create a mental health working group amongst the parliamentarians. So if you talk about policies, then parliamentarians play a big role as a former parliamentarian. So that's also something that perhaps we can talk offline. But I would love to hear from you.
Yeah.
What's the linkage between the two? Yeah.
It's an interesting question. Let me give my context. I just finished a book called The Ethics of ASEAN. The idea was to try to train to trail from the beginning, 1967. How has ASEAN started to set its priorities, and how does ASEAN try to deal with issues? The Myanmar issue is, of course, the biggest case study in an ethics issue. But it did take a long time for ASEAN to be able to create the human rights declarations, and those 40 articles are not implemented in actually any country, all 40, except Timor-Leste, which is not yet joining. But that was one of the things you were to. Okay, and so human rights as we can see, this idea of freedom, it's a big debate, right? We talk about Western values and individual freedom, etc. But the freedoms that people enjoy is also about positive freedoms. And poverty means that you have less freedom, right? A workplace can be free or less free. And much of the work, the progressive work that's been done in management, has been able to help people to have a voice, to have people to work together, to not to be fearing the boss and that kind of thing. So human rights is at the core. It's not the only core, because development is also very important. But human rights is at the core of the human development paradigm. And this is somewhat of an issue today, and I think we're seeing this paradigm shift, that yes, we've embraced human rights, and those human rights, one of them is the right of people to be able to work, right? That's also in the ASEAN Declaration. So if I have a child who's, let's say, autistic, right? Do I keep them at home? Do I go to special schools? I mean, if you have a child, you're going to take care of that child as a person, right? And so if your company says, well, no, we have, we're not going to take an autistic person into our company. We're not going to adopt or adapt the workplace for them to be able to contribute positively, then there's something that's wrong, and that's where the human rights would come in on this particular issue. So I'd say that on mental health and wellness, that issue of what do we actually expect people to be able to do, and how do we include people with temporary mental health issues as well as permanent mental health issues, how do we include them in the workplace is a very important point.
Oh, I just saw, but can I just, because I was already ready to ask that question. I think we had one good question actually just now, the previous one. I think it was shown on the screen for a very long time. Oh, no. Yeah. So this part, so in ASEAN, mental health is very much associated with shame. So how do policies help? Maybe just a quick touch on this, Bob.
I think companies, I'm also at the European Chamber of Commerce. And so we have a Human Development Committee. So we're dialogue partners in Singapore with the government. And on many of these issues, the government's going through, for example, this big law that they thought was going to take about a year. It's called the anti-discrimination law. Well, okay. But discrimination is like, it's really complicated, right? Because it's subjective. Am I really being discriminated against? As women, you can be discriminated against, ethnic, etc. But so companies have an important role in influencing governments to do something about it. ASEAN has an important role in helping governments to be able to work together, and we have some of those initiatives. And health has become something, particularly COVID, really was a game changer, because health really, human resource professionals were the heroes of the COVID pandemic, right? And so really you did a great job. It wasn't in your KPIs. It wasn't a productivity thing. It was something that you did because you had to, help people, and it was really a social question. So influence and having policies and being able to talk, the public-private dialogue and cooperation is extremely important. I think you'll find also that the Singapore government is now, it's going through its own paradigm shift, and it's much more open to what companies want to do. And we've seen this in many of the recent initiatives that we have in Singapore. But it's also quite important that you do this outside your home country, and that you start to look at what can we do in the other ASEAN countries.